Okay, hello and welcome to another sales chat. My name is John Golden from SalesPOP Online Sales Magazine and Pipeliner CRM here in the US. And I'm joined by my colleague, Martha Neumeister, who is in Vienna, and she's going to keep the show running. Today, we are delighted to welcome Colleen Stanley as our special guest today. And Colleen has got such a great background and pedigree. She's a keynote speaker, recognized as one of the top 50 sales bloggers over the last 3 years. She's the author of some great books, including Emotional Intelligence for Sales Success. And she has created the Emotional Intelligence Sales System. So welcome, Colleen.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and so if you're not familiar with the format, please do join in on Twitter, #SalesChats, and you can make your comments, you can answer the questions, you can ask us questions as we go through this. This is a 30-minute session. We're just focusing on one subject, and I love the topic today, 5 ways CEOs screw up the sales function. You know, having been a CEO myself, I'm looking forward to seeing all the damage that I did in the past and the lessons that I can personally learn from this. So Colleen, let's start out just a fundamental. Why do you think that leadership can have such a profound impact on the sales function negatively?
Negatively. Well, you know what's interesting, John, when you take a look, there's an old phrase, the pace of the leader is the pace of the pack. And sometimes what I will see with CEOs, they're still subscribing to the myth that salespeople are born, not developed. Sales managers are born, not developed. Now, I am the proud aunt of over 50 nieces and nephews, and I have yet to have one call me and say, Aunt Colleen, I've just given birth to a salesperson. And so part of this is, I think, maybe not unintentionally, but it's the last department systematized. If you take a look at it, my background is in manufacturing, which was a real gift to me because everything was about processes, systems, the warehouse, order entry, and even our sales process. And so I think sometimes where CEOs are getting caught up in this myth, they're not putting in the time, energy, or saying, hey, we've got to systematize this department. And that dramatically affects revenues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, part of that, I think, is that I think often, CEOs, particularly if they haven't come from a sales background themselves, and even if they have to some degree, are kind of not in awe of salespeople, but they're kind of loath to mess with them. It's like, you've probably seen this when you have some of your, top producing salespeople, but they just refuse to follow any kind of process at all, and you're kind of caught up in that thing. Oh, do I enforce it? Do I risk it? So, do you agree with that? Do you think there's maybe a lack of understanding, but also maybe a little bit of fear on behalf of CEOs to mess too much with it?
Well, and you call it the golden handcuffs, right? And so you've got the top producer bringing in $1 million or $2 million. Now, and this is, if the top producer isn't adhering to the rules, policies, what makes the whole company run, that is called a prima donna. And I think companies put up with too many of them because the sales teams I work with, and I work with some really good salespeople, they're not prima donnas. They're very competitive and they're collaborative, because if you think of a prima donna, Lone Ranger, high maintenance, self-centered. Now look at those words and ask yourself, can I really scale an organization with a bunch of these people? And number two, so let's say you can, because Lone Rangers statistically can sell pretty well, but is it the culture you want to build?
Right.
And so, you've got these nice posters on the wall that say teamwork, respect, and integrity. And in some organizations, I say to them, but you need to put at the bottom, unless you're bringing in $1 million, then you get to act like a jerk, right? And so I find people are stating values, but they're not honoring them. And so I think that's where there starts to be a decline, because at some point that culture isn't going to make it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've written obviously a lot about emotional intelligence, and obviously that's a key factor here, both on behalf of the leadership and the salespeople. So how do you create a culture where emotional intelligence plays a significant part?
Well, I think the first thing is creating the awareness, because when you think of emotional intelligence, it's a soft skill. Now think about the word association with the soft skill.
Mm.
squishy, kumbaya. This cannot possibly yield hard sales results. So some of it is the awareness and education on how soft skills absolutely do produce hard sales results. So in our training, we are advocates of linking what I call the sales IQ, which is your product knowledge, technical knowledge, sales training, consultative selling skills. We teach those. However, when you really start studying emotional intelligence, it's the sales EQ that often supports the execution of the right selling behaviors, attitudes, and habits. So it's really integrating sales IQ and EQ together. And when you do that, it's not an either or. So for example, John, a soft skill assertiveness. So that has been researched by the corporate executive board, found in some of your
Right.
top salespeople. But that's a soft skill. That is not a hard selling skill. And so assertiveness helps you not write practice proposals. You're assertive to say to a prospect, I don't think you're ready for us. I'm not hearing enough. You're assertive enough to ask for meetings with all the buying influences. You're assertive enough to ask for budget. So the soft skill helps in many selling stages and skill sets.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting concept, as you say, because again, I love that idea of salespeople being born. This and that myth continues to be perpetuated,
Right.
obviously, and we need more people to come into the sales arena anyway, and we need more professionalization. So we really need to get away from that idea. So again, getting back to the leadership and the CEO. Do you think to some degree like leadership reinforces that myth or some stereotypes because they tend to gravitate towards a particular type of salesperson rather than maybe the salesperson who's evolving and displaying the traits that you're talking about?
Well, they do. And I think what we do is we get into all or nothing thinking. And so, for example, we think somebody that's a high driver cannot possibly be a nice person. Right? We think somebody that is assertive lacks empathy. So I think that becomes the awareness piece. And when you study leadership, and in fact, the Center for Creative Leadership out of North Carolina did an interesting study. They administered the EQI assessment. It's the one we use in sales training as well. So they studied 302 CEOs and top managers, some doing well and some struggling. And when they really took a look at the data, almost 30% of their success was based on the EQ skills. So for example, when you look at a really good leader, one of the competencies that came forth was they're centered and grounded. Now think about that from a leading an organization. So these aren't people that get triggered every day when something, and how many triggers show up as a CEO, that, right? Personnel, supply chain, vendors. And so when you're centered, it means you have high self-control, self-management. But also what that means for your team is I can trust how John's going to show up.
Right.
Because regardless of what adversity hits, John's centered. He doesn't fly off the handle. Because, there's a term called emotional contagion. And you absolutely, the mood of the leader can affect the mood of the entire company. So that's just one trait you'll see, but it's an EQ skill that absolutely affects your ability to be predictable. And predictability means you're consistent, and that means I can trust you. How are you going to show up every day?
Yeah. So can you give me some examples? I mean, not company names or anything, but can you give me some examples of when you've engaged with an organization and maybe how the leadership or the CEO was behaving beforehand, and then what you did to kind of turn that around and what the impact was?
That's an interesting, I will tell you, some of our folks that hire us already score high in the EQ.
Oh, okay.
Because whether they've named it, labeled it that or not, once they start understanding the vernacular, the definitions, they'll go, oh, that's who I am, and that's the culture that I'm building. And so now, but what I will share with you is in the training, EQ can be improved. So with that awareness, you will see people that all of a sudden discover, oh, wow, I'm not showing empathy here. I'm being, I call it generic empathy. So where we've seen some shifts is that they've got the competency, but they grow it. And so let's take a look at empathy, the major influence skill, right? Because as a leader, how can I possibly influence another human being if I don't know, think about, or care what you're thinking or feeling?
Right.
And I can be paying attention. I know where to meet you. And then in the sales function, if I'm paying attention to the nonverbals, I know how to adjust and shift. I might bring up the objection before they do. So those are the skills that we find that they may have a pretty good baseline, but now they know how to grow it and really use it to the sales function. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I love that idea of emotional contagion, actually. I'm going to remember that one. So what are some of the other ways that, CEOs or leadership can negatively impact the sales function, and what can they do to address it?
Well, again, the pace of the leader is the pace of the pack. So if you have a CEO that's lacking what we call emotional self-awareness, and that's the mega skill, John, because, emotional self-awareness is the ability to know thyself. And if you don't know yourself, pretty hard to know others, right? And without emotional intelligence, you are bound to repeat some of the same mistakes.
Right.
And so as a CEO, if you don't really take the time to reflect, how did I show up today? What triggers did I respond to that caused me to respond in a manner I regret? I call it the trigger response regret loop. Was I the trigger? Because, if you've seen a hard charging CEO, if you don't have this awareness, I can tell you just myself, I can put people into a fight or flight stance so fast. I'm not watching my demeanor. I start getting in your face. My tonality gets more intense. My face gets more intense. And then all of a sudden I've got people doing the yeah, but. And then I'm getting irritated because they're giving me excuses. Well, where did it start? It started with how I showed up to the conversation.
Right.
So emotional self-awareness is a mega skill for both salespeople and CEOs. How am I showing up? Because the triggers aren't going away.
Yeah.
So it's your response. And we've all known that through lots of self-development work. It's the response, and that's the only thing you could change.
Yeah, absolutely. So what about CEOs or senior leadership in particular about empowering sales management, right? Because, let's face it, I mean, sales management is one of the toughest jobs out there. And we often pay lip service, we want you to be a coach, we want you to develop and all of that. And then, it's coming to the end of the month, and all we're doing is, what's up with this deal? What's up with that deal? What's coming in? So how should CEOs and leadership empower sales management really to be successful, and how can they behave maybe differently?
I have a great deal of passion and compassion for sales managers, because I think most of them get set up to fail, John.
Yeah.
Because you really take a look at it, as a sales professional, you have a certain set of skills that you develop. You get into sales management, you take a sharp right turn, an entirely different set of skill sets. You've got to learn how to hire great people. You want to get good, you want to run good companies, get good at hiring, right? Well, I never attended a formal behavior-based interviewing course before I was a manager. You have to be comfortable holding people accountable. But they've never had those conversations, the fierce conversations, the crucial conversations, training and coaching skills. Very different going from a producer to teaching the skills and habits that made you successful. So with that said, one of the things CEOs have to just accept, you're going to have to provide some training for that sales manager. Now, they might learn it on their own, because I was always a fairly good trainer. I had to learn coaching. I've always been good at systems and processes, but there were still things, if I'd gotten some additional education, I would have even been a better sales manager. So CEOs, you're going to have to provide some education. They're not coming in with the knowledge. At some point they might, if universities and high schools and grade schools start teaching it. This one's on you, CEOs.
Yeah, I mean, because it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? Like, a CEO, you wouldn't hire somebody to look after your accounting department who didn't have accounting qualifications, right? But you're quite happy to promote or hire somebody into a position that, like, is revenue, is the lifeblood of the company, without formal training.
Right. And so it would be nice if they're getting it in college, and more are. I'm seeing that. But until that happens, this one's on the CEO. And, I'm married to an attorney, and we were making a joke because, he's turning 65 this year, and he started laughing because he gets this notice and he no longer has to take CLEs, continuous learning education.
Oh, okay.
And because with every industry, they have to keep up their learning, right? So he made this joke. He said, gosh, at 65, I get to be a stupid attorney. And I said, well, in my world where there's no education unless they're hiring us. So, I mean, I find it interesting. All these other industries demand learning. And then there's, like you said, the chief revenue officer gets none of it. So.
Yeah. Well, I like that. The alternative, of course, for your husband is that he actually maybe has just reached genius status now, so he doesn't have anything else to learn.
Well, he's pretty good, but you know, he's a constant learner as well, which is what makes him very good. Yeah.
And I think that touches on a fundamental point about organization and culture and CEO, is that whether you are a learning organization or an organization that celebrates continuous improvement and continuous learning, that's another thing. Do you see enough organizations take a step back and, you know, to learn and to educate, or especially in the sales function, because it tends to get very frenetic?
Right.
When you see people doing that, what impact does that have?
Well, you know, when you look at it so I'll back up a little bit, John. In the EI world, there's research that solidly supports that your best sales professionals are scoring high in what they call a term self-actualization. You're on a journey of personal and professional improvement, right? So this is the joke I make with my clients. Everybody says, we want to be a trusted advisor. We want to be a value-added partner. Well, I got news for you. If you're not reading, studying, honing your skills, you're showing up to prospect meetings or customer meetings with the same data you had 2 years ago. And the world changes dramatically in 2 years. So we can talk trusted advisor all we want. The way you become a trusted advisor is you create these cultures of learning. And so obviously people that hire us, John, somewhat have those cultures, because otherwise they wouldn't invest the dollars time there. But it does take a habit. And so I think learning is like anything. It's a habit. You've got to carve out time for it. Sales managers in their meetings, quit making them roll call meetings, just pipeline meetings. Training and development. What skill are we working on today? What thought leadership are we going to embrace? And so it needs to be very intentional, because when you take a look at it, this is really what falls into Covey's, you know, famous quadrant 1, quadrant 2. Training and development falls in it's important but not urgent. Because, see, all of these other fires, the tyranny of the urgent, pull you away from really what makes you money. So this is where you have to have the awareness and manage your impulse control to always go after the instant gratification and put time in the delayed gratification bucket, which is development.
Yeah, I mean, I always say to people, you know, having been with Huthwaite and other organizations where, you know, we were doing sales performance improvement and training, is that if you just took a random 100 CEOs and lined them up and said, how many of you think training is important? All 100 will put their hands up. And then if you said, how many of you are investing money and have put budget aside for training this year? You might get a handful.
That's right. So, and you know what I saw it really show up, John, was in 2008. So, you know, the whole that just, you know, terrible economic crisis we had. And, you know, there were, in fairness, some industries that just got clobbered, real estate, construction. I will share with you, though, our clients and even our firm, we did well during 2008. Now, part of it is we had clients that were going to continue to invest. And you also had clients that said, no matter what the economy is doing, we've got to continue getting better. And I promise you, most of our clients made it through because they had these learning cultures that knew how to pivot when that economy started tanking.
Yeah, and actually, you bring up an interesting point, because I had this conversation with a number of companies around that time, right? Where, you know, pre-2008, you know, everybody was busting their quotas and everything. Yeah. And I had this conversation afterwards, and they say, oh, you know, our sales team used to be so good, you know, and now they're not performing. And I would say, how do you know they were good? And they'd say, well, you know, they were bringing in great numbers. And I said, yeah, but everybody was. Budgets were huge. We were spending money. You don't know whether they're actually any good at selling at all. Now you're finding out. And I think, to your point, I think the organizations who were investing in training and continue to invest in training of their people, you know, weathered that storm far better.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. Well, and you know what? One thing I get... whatever the word is, worried. I think for a CEO, you've really got to watch the arrogance piece, because, you know, I grew up in a startup that eventually went public. They're now the largest in the world. They're a great American success story. But I will tell you, I had some terrific bosses, and my boss was Klein Boyd. And when he'd come into our meetings on Monday morning and we were getting written up in the papers, we were blowing and going, he'd just always say, well, folks, let's just not believe our own press too much. Because arrogance means you get complacent, mediocrity. We don't need to learn anymore. We don't need to innovate. So I think there's a fair amount of arrogance going on before 2008. And it might have been the product that was selling.
Yeah.
Your sales weren't that good. You just had a great product that was on the early side of the innovation curve and hadn't hit the commodity bucket. So.
Yeah, and when people have overflowing budgets, you know, they like to spend them.
Yeah.
So getting back to where we started here, I think a lot of this obviously comes back to systemization, right? Mm-hmm. And the fact that if your sales manager is going to be able to be a coach and, you know, really help educate and develop his salespeople, you have to systematize that, because otherwise, you know, let's face it, if I put a coaching session on my calendar for you once a week or, you know, once a month or whatever, what's the first thing that gets canceled?
Yes.
When something comes up, it's the coaching session, right?
So
it just communicates to you what importance I put on it. So how do you advise people to get their head around this idea of systematizing sales when, you know, so many people have always kind of shied away from that?
Well, you know, I think it goes back to realizing the importance, okay, because you really cannot coach unless you've got a sales playbook. There's nothing to coach against. And, you know, you can use the very, very overused analogy of athletics, but it's still a pretty good one. So you've got these, you know, top 1% of the world. What are they doing? They're running plays. They're running defined plays. They're watching post-game films. Well, as a sales organization, you can't even run the play because you don't have it defined. And so when you're systematizing your sales organization, you've got to systematize your hiring process, because there could be a different set of interview questions for a BDR, business development rep, versus account executive versus account management. You've got to systematize your business development process. What are the scripts? What's the activity plans for your organization? Some you might spend more time on referrals. Others it might be, I literally have some companies that still do well with foot canvassing, John. They're knocking on.
Good for them.
That's the right thing to do. Well, they're getting results because that's what their industry demands, right? And then you've got the sales process. So likability, what are the questions? What are the objections? Frequently asked, and then account management, and then there's the sale after the sale. So all of those need to be documented, and guess who's going to be doing the documenting? The sales manager.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So has the CEO hired a sales manager that actually likes doing that? Or if they don't, maybe then you bring in an instructional designer, you bring in a sales training firm. Okay. Now, I was always a sales manager that liked it. Obviously, that's why I ended up in this business. But do not kid yourself. The sales manager has to own that process. And if they don't like documentation, I still see a few sales managers that are wing it. I don't like scripts and that. And I said, well, if you don't like scripts, what are your people saying? Because if they knew what to say, they would. So they make a mistake on hiring their sales manager, because your best managers like structure, they like process and systems. Because those can be duplicated. And that's what I've seen with my great managers. They're systems oriented. They might need a little help with it, but they ultimately like systems.
Yeah, and I think to that point about, you know, what are your salespeople saying, is that if you go back to the CEO level, the senior leadership level, you know, you can put together a strategy and a vision for your company, right? And you know, marketing can go and put that into the words and everything you want. But if it's not filtered down through the sales organization, then your message is not getting out to the primary interface with your customers and prospects, right?
Right. Well, and the other thing, John, to your point, marketing's putting together the message, but I'd ask CEOs this question. What are the key performance metrics for your marketing department writing along with your salespeople? I don't care if they're listening to phone calls or they're face-to-face. How can they write marketing copy if they're not listening to sales conversations? There's a huge disconnect there. You can't write marketing copy, because I know when I was a sales manager, I always made sure I traveled a lot, because there was something different when you heard it from a prospect telling you no. I could tell you, I quickly revamped, we need this product, we got to improve this. then if you're, I hate to say it, but if you're in the White House, you're not quite there. So.
Yeah. Well, because as you know, I mean, you can build a product or you can design a service or whatever, but you'll never come up you never come up with the ways the customers will use it, and you'll never come up with the reasons why they don't want to use it.
Right. So you've got to get out of your comfortable seat and get in front of these prospects and customers. Nothing replaces hearing it from them in their words. That's how you write good marketing copy. That's how you have good sales copy.
So in the last couple of moments here, there's two things I want to ask you. But first, to round out this conversation, how could somebody watching or listening in now sort of gauge whether they have good emotional, good EIQ, and how would they see whether their leadership or organization is displaying this?
Well,
how can they tell?
Right. So, what I see with high emotionally intelligent cultures, you've got this self-awareness. You also have high self-regard cultures. And I think this is really important, both for the CEO and then how he or she sets the pace. High self-regard cultures have confidence, but they also have the ability to admit their strengths or weaknesses. And guess what that means? You don't have CYA, you don't have blame and excuses, and you have people that have high ownership. And when you see high ownership cultures, they move fast because you're focusing on the right thing. You own it, get the lesson learned, move on, right? If you have emotionally intelligent sales cultures, it's a nice place to work. You actually hear about your peer. You'll take the time to build relationships. Everybody's always saying they're building relationships, but they can't get off their technology. Relationships is what we're doing.
Yeah.
I'm not answering my phone. I'm not checking email. And so I think the more awareness you get there, it is a nice place to work. And guess what happened? And it's an intelligent place to work. So guess what happens to retention?
Yeah, it goes through the roof.
I like working here. I don't have turnover. I'm getting smarter. And when I get smarter, I get better. So it all works together in a very positive way.
Yeah, I love that. So in our last moment, one of the things we always like to ask our guests is, what's your power tip? What do you do every day to set you, Colleen Stanley, up for success?
I absolutely, really, and it's really since I've started studying the emotional intelligence, I absolutely carve out downtime every morning. And so I am very intentional about getting the downtime, reflection time, gratitude time, examining myself. How did I show up? How do I want to show up? And this is not new, John. And in fact, you've got Google that's teaching mindfulness classes, right? You've got everybody's understanding it. But the fact is, we're still not doing it.
Right.
So I'm going to challenge CEOs that if you want to show up better, be the person, set the pace for the emotional contagion. Nothing replaces the power of downtime, because a cluttered mind's not a clear mind. A cluttered mind's not a creative mind. And we need that in order to continue moving forward with the right energy and right messages. So downtime's the number one.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. So downtime. What's that?
And exercise. So I took a hike this morning purposely. So I got my downtime in, and then I took exercise. I am very, very diligent about getting exercise.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, so in the last moments, Colleen, why don't you just tell the viewers a little bit more about yourself, about your company, how they can contact you, and the types of things you can help them with?
Thank you very much. So you could definitely go to our website. It's www.salesleadershipdevelopment.com. And we have a lot of resources there. We do a video blog, weekly blogs. You've got a what's your sales EQ quiz. And then as far as what we do, really we work on all sides of the sales development. So we may help you with your hiring playbooks. We've got consultants that'll go on site, maybe help you with strategy if that's where you need help. Obviously, sales training is a big bucket. So we combine emotional intelligence with all of our consultative sales training. We do corporate end. You can come to public boot camps if you're a smaller client. And then we also have EI sales management courses. So both public and corporate offerings there. And then for companies that are kicking off their maybe a product launch or their national sales meeting, I go out and do a lot of keynotes. And so those are more on the motivational kind of entertainment type of venues.
Great. Well, listen, thanks again, Colleen, for joining us. And you can find Colleen's books on SalesPOP as well in our library, in our bookstore. My name is John Golden from SalesPOP Online Sales Magazine and Pipeliner CRM. And Martha, it looks a bit chilly there in Vienna today, is it? You have your scarf on.
It is, yeah.
So thanks, Martha, for keeping everything going technically and running the Twitter feed. And again, Colleen, this has been a fantastic conversation. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yes, thank you, John. Thank you, Martha. Have a good rest of the week. Bye-bye.